Trump says 90% of China's oil goes through Hormuz. The real number is nowhere close. President Trump has said it more than once, on camera, while pushing other countries to help police the Strait of Hormuz, that roughly 90% of China's oil imports pass through that single waterway. If that were true, a full closure of the strait wouldn't just hurt China's economy, it would be an extinction-level economic event for the world's second-largest economy. But that number is not true. It's not even close. So today we're asking the real question properly. If Hormuz genuinely closed fully for months, what would actually happen to China? Would its economy actually collapse? Or has Beijing already built something specifically designed to survive exactly this scenario? The real data tells a story that's far more interesting and far more revealing about how modern economic warfare actually works than the 90% headline ever could. Stay with me, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more content like this. Let's start with a number, because this entire question depends on getting it right, and almost nobody discussing it publicly actually has. President Trump has claimed on more than one occasion, most notably in comments to reporters aboard Air Force One, that approximately 90% of China's crude oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. He has used that figure specifically to pressure Beijing into playing a larger role in policing the waterway during the ongoing conflict with Iran, since the logic is straightforward. If China depends on that strait for nearly all of its oil, it has every incentive to help keep it open. Here's the problem. That number is wrong, not slightly off, substantially, meaningfully wrong. According to Chinese customs data analyzed independently by multiple fact-checking organizations, less than 40% of China's imported crude oil actually passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Other independent estimates from energy analysts put the figure somewhere between 40 and 50% of China's seaborne crude imports specifically, which is a meaningfully different number once you account for the oil China receives through pipelines rather than by ship. And here's the detail that matters most of all, the one almost nobody repeating Trump's 90% figure ever mentions. Oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz accounts for only about 6.6% of China's total energy consumption, once you factor in domestic production, pipeline imports, coal, natural gas, and the rapidly expanding renewable energy sector that now makes up a meaningfully larger share of China's overall energy mix than it did even 5 years ago. Why does that specific distinction matter so much? Because it changes the entire shape of the question we're actually trying to answer. If 90% of China's oil ran through this single choke point, a full closure would represent something close to a genuine national economic emergency, the kind of shock that could plausibly threaten real instability. If the real number is closer to somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of seaborne crude imports, specifically representing a mid-single-digit percentage of the country's total energy consumption, we're talking about something considerably more manageable, a serious and painful economic headwind, but categorically different from an existential threat. So let's actually build out the realistic picture, because that's what this video is for, not repeating a political talking point in either direction, but working through what a genuine, sustained closure of this waterway would actually mean for the second largest economy on the planet. Let's start with why China is exposed at all, because the exposure is real, even if the 90% figure isn't. China is the world's largest crude oil importer, bringing in roughly 11 million barrels a day to fuel an economy that remains, despite years of energy transition efforts, still heavily dependent on fossil fuels for industrial production, transportation, and electricity generation. A meaningful share of that oil comes from Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and, through a complicated and heavily sanctioned channel we'll get to shortly, Iran itself. Virtually all of that Gulf-sourced oil has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to reach Chinese ports, because there is no realistic alternative maritime route out of the Persian Gulf that avoids this specific 21-mile-wide choke point between Iran and Oman. But here's where things become far more complicated than a single dependency number can capture, because China has spent roughly 2 decades deliberately building a set of structural buffers specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of disruption, and those buffers are not theoretical. They have already been tested in real time over the past several months, during the actual conflict currently unfolding between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Let's walk through each one of these buffers individually, because understanding them is the only way to actually answer the collapse question honestly. The first and most immediate buffer is China's strategic and commercial crude oil reserves, which independent estimates place somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 billion barrels as of earlier this year. To put that number in perspective, that's roughly 4 months of China's total import needs sitting in storage, ready to be drawn down the moment a supply disruption actually materializes. This is not a small or symbolic stockpile. It represents one of the largest strategic energy reserves held by any single country in the world, built specifically and deliberately over the past 2 decades as Chinese policymakers became increasingly aware of exactly this kind of choke point vulnerability. The second buffer is domestic production. China still produces roughly 27% of its total oil consumption from its own domestic fields, a share that, while insufficient to make the country energy independent, meaningfully reduces the proportion of its total consumption that depends on any imported source at all, let alone one specific choke point. The third buffer, and this is genuinely one of the more fascinating and underreported pieces of this entire story, involves China's relationship with sanctioned Iranian oil specifically. Since the reimposition of American sanctions on Iranian crude exports, large state-owned Chinese refiners have largely withdrawn from directly and openly purchasing Iranian oil, for obvious reasons related to their own exposure to the American financial system. But smaller, independently operated refineries, known informally as teapot refineries and concentrated heavily in Shandong province, have continued absorbing significant volumes of discounted Iranian crude, often routed through intermediaries, specifically to preserve what analysts describe as plausible deniability at the state level. Multiple independent estimates suggest this parallel supply chain has accounted for more than 1 million barrels per day flowing into China in recent years. Oil that does not show up cleanly in official trade statistics, but nonetheless represents a real and substantial supplement to China's overall energy security, one specifically built around exploiting exactly the kind of sanctions regime currently constraining Iran's formal oil exports. This arrangement matters enormously for understanding the deeper irony sitting underneath this entire crisis. China has spent years quietly benefiting from Iran's isolation, since sanctioned Iranian crude, unable to find many other willing buyers, has historically traded at a meaningful discount, specifically to attract exactly the kind of price-sensitive, risk-tolerant buyers that Shandong's independent refiners represent. That dynamic means China's exposure to a Hormuz disruption is genuinely complicated in a way a single dependency percentage can never fully capture. On one hand, China depends on oil that moves through this exact waterway. On the other hand, a significant portion of that specific oil has been arriving at below-market prices precisely because of the same sanctions regime and geopolitical isolation that make this entire crisis so volatile in the first place. If sanctions were fully lifted and Iran's oil became broadly available on the open market again, some analysts have actually suggested Iranian crude could become considerably less attractive to Chinese buyers specifically, since the discount that currently makes it so appealing depends heavily on Iran having comparatively few other willing purchasers. The fourth buffer is pipeline diversification, specifically China's deepening energy relationship with Russia. Unlike oil arriving by tanker through maritime choke points, the crude oil China imports from Russia moves substantially by pipeline across their shared land border, a route that is structurally immune to exactly the kind of naval disruption or strait closure that threatens Gulf-sourced maritime shipments. Russia has become an increasingly significant supplier to China, specifically because this pipeline infrastructure offers a form of energy security that maritime routes simply cannot match, and Chinese imports from Russia have continued climbing steadily since sanctions related to the war in Ukraine pushed Moscow to redirect exports that had previously flowed toward Europe. And the fifth buffer, the one with the longest time horizon but arguably the most structurally significant implications, is China's continuing and accelerating transition toward renewable energy and electric vehicles. China has explicitly targeted raising the share of non-fossil fuels in its total energy consumption to 25% by 2030, up from roughly 21.7% as of last year. Every percentage point of that transition represents oil demand that simply doesn't need to be imported at all from anywhere through any route, regardless of what's happening in the Persian Gulf on any given day. Now here's the part that moves this entire conversation from theoretical resilience into demonstrated real-world performance, because we don't actually have to speculate about how China would respond to a Hormuz disruption. We've already watched it happen in real time over the past several months of this exact conflict. Since the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran began on February 28th, disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz to varying degrees ever since, China has deliberately and dramatically cut its own crude oil imports from roughly 11.7 million barrels a day in February down to under 9 million barrels a day by late May. That reduction, according to analysis from J.P. Morgan, accounted for an estimated 74% of the entire decline in global crude oil demand during this period of conflict, a genuinely disproportionate share of the total global adjustment to this crisis. Multiple analysts covering global energy markets have specifically described China's behavior during this crisis as functioning like an invisible hand, rebalancing an otherwise extremely tight and volatile market, absorbing a shock that could otherwise have pushed prices considerably higher, considerably faster than what actually occurred. Think about what that actually represents strategically, because it's genuinely remarkable when you sit with it properly. Despite global crude supply falling by an estimated 14% since the war began, and despite some analysts initially forecasting prices could spike as high as $200 a barrel, Brent crude has largely stayed in a considerably more contained range, spiking into the high 90s during periods of acute escalation, but not sustaining anywhere near the catastrophic levels initially feared. Analysts at Société Générale specifically credited China's demand reduction as one of the single largest offsetting forces in the entire global market, larger even than the coordinated strategic reserve releases from the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. It's worth comparing this moment to the closest genuine historical precedent because the contrast is instructive. Société Générale analysts specifically noted that the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which removed roughly 7% of global crude supply from the market, produced a price increase of 134% almost immediately. The current crisis has removed a considerably larger share of global supply, roughly 14% by some estimates, yet prices have moved nowhere near that same multiple. That gap between the scale of the supply shock and the comparatively muted price response is almost entirely attributable to China's deliberate demand reduction, functioning as a kind of pressure release valve that simply did not exist in any comparable form during the 1973 crisis. This is not an accident of market conditions. It is the direct, visible result of policy choices Beijing has been making in real time throughout this specific conflict. But here's the real question underneath all of this, and it's the one that determines whether China's current strategy represents genuine long-term resilience or simply a very effective way of buying time. Standard economic modeling of China's sensitivity to oil price shocks suggests that a 25% increase in oil prices translates to roughly a half percentage point reduction in Chinese GDP growth, a meaningful but far from catastrophic effect on an economy of China's overall scale. That kind of hit would be genuinely painful, particularly layered on top of China's existing structural economic challenges, including a prolonged property sector downturn and persistent deflationary pressure in its domestic consumer economy. But it is categorically different from the kind of shock that would threaten actual economic collapse in any meaningful sense of that word. And that's precisely where the scenario analysis needs to get considerably more specific, because would Hormuz closing collapse China's economy is actually several different questions depending on exactly what kind of closure we're talking about, and for how long. In the scenario where the Strait experiences continued intermittent disruption, similar to the pattern we've actually observed throughout this conflict, periodic attacks on shipping, temporary spikes in insurance costs, occasional total halts lasting days rather than months, China's existing toolkit, reserves, domestic production, the Shandong teapot refinery network, Russian pipeline imports, and continued demand destruction through its renewable transition appears more than sufficient to manage the disruption without anything resembling genuine economic crisis. This is, in fact, essentially the scenario that has already played out over the past several months, and China's economy, while facing real headwinds from higher energy costs, has not experienced anything close to collapse. In a considerably more severe scenario, a genuinely sustained, near-total closure lasting not weeks but many months, potentially extending well into 2027, the picture becomes meaningfully more serious. Some energy analysts have specifically modeled scenarios where Brent crude could climb toward $200 a barrel if American-Iranian negotiations fail entirely and the strait remains substantially closed for an extended period. Under that kind of sustained, severe price environment, China's 4-month strategic reserve buffer would eventually deplete if not carefully managed, forcing increasingly difficult trade-offs between maintaining strategic reserves and meeting actual daily consumption needs. Persistently elevated energy costs would compound China's existing deflationary pressures and weak domestic demand environment, creating a genuinely serious macroeconomic headwind, one that could meaningfully slow growth, strain already stretched local government finances, and complicate Beijing's broader economic management challenges considerably. But even in that more severe scenario, collapse remains the wrong word for what would actually happen, according to the overwhelming consensus of energy and economic analysts who have modeled this specific question. What you would more likely see is a considerably more painful version of exactly the adjustment already underway: deeper cuts to discretionary consumption, accelerated investment in domestic and renewable energy alternatives, further diversification toward Russian and other non-Hormuz-dependent suppliers, and a meaningfully slower growth trajectory for the Chinese economy over an extended period, rather than any kind of sudden systemic failure or economic breakdown. There's also a genuinely important counter-scenario worth understanding, because it flips the entire risk calculus in a way most coverage of this crisis has largely ignored. Energy analysts and the International Energy Agency itself have specifically warned that a relatively rapid reopening of the strait, rather than a prolonged closure, could actually create the opposite problem for global oil markets: a significant oversupply. The IEA's own modeling suggests that if Gulf production returns to normal levels and roughly 100 million barrels of currently stranded oil gets released back into the market simultaneously, global supply growth could outstrip demand by more than 4.5 million barrels a day next year. For China specifically, that scenario is genuinely double-edged. On one hand, a supply glut would likely push prices down considerably, providing real relief after months of elevated energy costs. On the other hand, one of the very few countries with the strategic reserve capacity and import appetite to actually absorb that kind of sudden oversupply, according to commodities analysts tracking this market closely, is China itself, once again positioning Beijing as a uniquely pivotal actor in how this entire crisis ultimately resolves, regardless of which direction the resolution actually goes. Now, here's a detail about this entire situation that deserves far more attention than it typically receives, because it reveals something genuinely important about how China is actually choosing to navigate this crisis. Despite having, by a considerable margin, the largest single-country exposure to any disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, China is not a formal party to the negotiations between the United States and Iran over how to permanently resolve this crisis and reopen the strait on a durable basis. Beijing has no seat at that table. Think about what that absence actually represents. The country most economically exposed to how this crisis resolves is deliberately choosing to manage its exposure quietly through its own independent toolkit of reserves, demand reduction, and supply diversification, rather than through direct diplomatic engagement or confrontation with either Washington or Tehran. Reporting has indicated that Chinese officials have engaged in quiet, targeted diplomatic conversations with Iran specifically to secure safe passage for certain vessels, including cargo carrying Qatari crude and liquefied natural gas that China specifically depends on. But this represents narrow, transactional engagement, rather than any broader attempt to insert itself into the formal negotiating process shaping the conflict's ultimate resolution. This pattern of careful, narrow engagement rather than broad diplomatic involvement is entirely consistent with how China has approached its relationship with Iran throughout this entire conflict, and arguably for years before it as well. Beijing has cultivated a genuinely significant economic relationship with Tehran, built substantially around discounted energy purchases and infrastructure investment, without ever taking on the kind of formal political alliance commitments that would obligate China to actively defend Iranian interests in a shooting war against the United States and Israel. That arrangement has served China well for years, precisely because it allowed Beijing to capture the economic upside of Iran's isolation from Western markets without inheriting any of the geopolitical liability that a more formal alliance relationship would create. The current crisis is, in many ways, the ultimate stress test of that exact strategy, and so far at least, it appears to be holding. One analyst put China's overall strategic posture in this crisis in genuinely useful terms. This is not the hill China intends to die on. Beijing has calculated, reasonably based on everything we've just walked through, that it has sufficient tools to manage this specific disruption without needing to take on the political, diplomatic, and potential military risks that would come with more direct involvement in a conflict that is ultimately primarily a dispute between the United States, Israel, and Iran. That calculation does not mean China is unconcerned about how this resolves. It means China has concluded, at least for now, that quiet resilience serves its interests better than direct confrontation or high-profile diplomatic intervention. So let's bring this all together and answer the actual question directly, because that's what you came here for. Would a genuine closure of the Strait of Hormuz collapse China's economy? Based on the actual data, rather than the exaggerated political rhetoric surrounding this question, the honest answer is no, not in any meaningful sense of that word, at least not under any scenario that is actually played out, or that serious analysts consider realistically likely. China's real dependency on this specific waterway is considerably smaller than frequently claimed. Its strategic buffers are genuinely substantial and have already been tested successfully under real wartime conditions. And its demonstrated willingness to absorb significant short-term demand, destruction specifically to manage this exact crisis, represents exactly the kind of structural resilience that a country genuinely facing existential economic risk would not be able to display so effectively. It's worth noting one final complicating factor before we get to the bottom line, because it prevents this analysis from becoming too tidy. The Hormuz crisis extends well beyond crude oil itself into downstream products that are considerably harder for China to stockpile or substitute quickly. Fertilizer production and the sulfur dioxide used in aluminum and nickel processing both depend heavily on Gulf region supply chains that run through this same waterway. And unlike oil, there is no comparable coordinated international strategic reserve system for these specific industrial inputs. A sufficiently prolonged disruption could create real bottlenecks in these narrower but still economically significant supply chains, even in a scenario where China's core energy security remains fundamentally intact through the buffers we've just walked through in detail. But won't collapse is not the same thing as won't be seriously hurt. A sufficiently prolonged and severe disruption would create genuine, meaningful economic pain for China, compounding existing structural challenges around property sector weakness and deflationary pressure, and potentially constraining Beijing's broader economic policy options for years rather than months. The realistic picture sits somewhere between the two extremes currently dominating public discussion, considerably more serious than dismissive optimism suggests, but considerably less catastrophic than the 90% dependency figure and the language of economic collapse would imply. Watch specifically for how China's crude import volumes evolve over the coming months, since that single data point, more than any political statement from any government, will tell you the most accurate real-time story about how seriously Beijing actually views its exposure to this crisis. Watch for whether China's quiet, narrow diplomatic engagement with Iran over specific vessel safe passage expands into something more substantial, which would signal Beijing's calculus shifting toward greater direct involvement. And watch closely for how Chinese strategic reserve levels move over the coming months, since a sustained, aggressive drawdown of those reserves would represent the clearest possible signal that Beijing's other buffers are proving insufficient to manage this crisis on their own. The story of China and the Strait of Hormuz is ultimately a story about the difference between genuine vulnerability and calculated resilience, and about how easily political rhetoric can exaggerate the former while ignoring the very real, very deliberate work that has gone into building the latter. Understanding that distinction tells you far more about how this crisis will actually unfold than any single percentage figure repeated at a press conference ever could. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us whether you think China's current strategy of quiet resilience will hold if this crisis genuinely drags on for another year, or whether you think Beijing is simply buying time before a much harder set of choices eventually arrives. That question, more than any single statistic we've covered today, is the one that will actually determine how this entire situation unfolds from here. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell, because how China navigates this exposure is going to shape global energy markets and the broader US-China relationship for years to come. And we will be here covering every significant development as it happens.